Alrighty, welcome back to Dark Side of the Mic, and today we're going to look, surprise surprise, at the SC Electronics DynaCaster. And this is a microphone, I have to be honest, that I've been crying out for them to do for a while now. I think their V7 and V7X mics are simply the best dynamics you can buy, not just on a budget, but pretty much any budget. Their capsules really provide the sort of sound that you associate with much higher end, more expensive microphones. I think they punch way above their weight. But those of course are handheld mics, and the DynaCaster is a broadcast style end address dynamic, really optimised for those close talk spoken word applications. Now, a couple of videos ago I reviewed the vintage Beyerdynamic M59. That's a 30-year-old mic, and I was asking at the time, have we reached a plateau of what dynamics could offer in terms of sound quality? Does it get any better than that? Well, you could argue that SC Electronics have made a decent stab at that with the DynaCaster, and despite having a name that reminds me of a lawnmower or a piece of home gym equipment, they've packed a lot of technology into this. Firstly, this is a switchable active dynamic, so you have the option to run the mic in passive mode. This is what I'm doing at the moment with it connected to my Golden Age Project Pre-73 preamp, and it's set to 55 dB of gain, and it works like your typical gain-hungry dynamic. But it also has a switch on the back that provides 30 dB of clean gain if you run the mic through phantom power. So that's like having a cloud lifter built into the mic without the extra cabling or devices sticking out the back. It's a much neater solution, and also offers potentially a much cleaner signal if your preamps are typically quite hissy when they're using dynamic mics. So in order to demonstrate that then, we're now recording through my RØDECaster Pro, which I think does struggle a little bit with gain-hungry mics. It's not horrendous, but it is a little bit hissy. So in order to be hitting negative 12 dB on the levels for normal spoken word, I have my gain set at 50 out of 55 on the RØDECaster. I'm 2 inches off the mic with it pointed at the corner of my mouth. This is how it sounds. So let's stop for a few seconds of silence and we'll put the noise floor figures on the screen. So now we've selected the 30 dB Dynamite switch on the back of the DynaCaster, and we've activated phantom power on the RØDECaster, which allows us to get our gain down to 20 out of 55, and we're still hitting our target of negative 12 dB on the levels. So let's again stop for a second of noise floor. Okay, so while we're not recording on the dark side of the moon here, my room here is treated and fairly quiet, and if you're wearing headphones I think you can definitely hear a significant reduction in noise floor, which is about a 5 to 6 dB improvement according to the readings in Adobe Audition. I think the activated recording sounds more full-bodied as well, whereas the passive recording on the RØDECaster Pro does sound considerably thinner, and I think that's symptomatic of what happens when you start pushing preamps to their limits. Now obviously it's up to you if that's worth it to you in terms of the additional cost this entails. It's like all things in audio. Most improvements tend to offer incremental changes, which on their own are often quite subtle. Not everyone hears them. But follow your ears, and more importantly follow your wallet and decide what's right for you. Okay, so at this point we're running the DynaCaster through my Mackie VLZ3 mixer, and we've kept the mic in active mode with phantom power engaged. Now, as well as having the Dynamite switch on the back of the mic, there are also 2 recessed EQ switches that provide flat, cut and boost options for the low end, and 2 presence boost options in the high end. So you effectively have 9 voicing options or combinations to tailor your sound at the point of capture. And those work in both passive or active mode on the mic. So at the moment I'm recording in flat mode or the unaffected EQ settings. Now I'm not going to go through every potential combination here, but we'll do the main ones. So at this point we've selected the bass boost option on the back of the mic, but we've kept the presence setting flat, so this in effect is the darkest setting that the mic can deliver. So you should instantly hear it being slightly more bassier and warmer, but I think it's still quite subtle, which I think is a good thing. A lot of mics which have this feature, the changes tend to be quite extreme, which I think tends to mean they get avoided rather than used in real world applications. So I think that's quite good to see. Now we've selected the low cut setting on the low end EQ switch, and you can instantly hear it thin out and get a bit less muddier perhaps. So again, very useful if you have a person with quite a deep voice, and it doesn't sound overly harsh either. It's quite a subtle change again, which doesn't affect the voice too negatively, and I think that's a good thing. Okay, so now we've put the low end switch back to flat and we've selected the first presence boost option on the high end switch, which is the milder presence boost. And according to the frequency response, this looks to be about a 4 to 5 dB presence boost, so fairly bright, but it still feels fairly smooth to me and adds a little bit more articulation for those perhaps with slightly darker voices. And predictably, now we've selected the second presence boost setting, which is the more extreme one. And according to the frequency response, this looks to be about a 7 or even 8 dB presence boost. So very bright and starting to get very airy and fairly sizzly up there. You can really hear it on the S sounds. I tend to think that anything over 5 dB is way too much for most voices in terms of sibilance, and it tends to get a bit fatiguing if you're listening with headphones especially. However, that's not to say this wouldn't be useful for guitars or miking amplifiers, other instruments even, if you're going for that particular sound. And just for a bit of fun, this is how it sounds with everything turned up to the max. So we have the bass boost turned on and the presence boost 2 is still activated. So this is your typical V-shaped sound that the millennials tend to love. And it gets you into that commercial radio sound. It almost feels a little bit compressed as well, which might be handy for those live output situations. This isn't really my cup of tea at all, but I have a feeling a lot of people will really love this option. So let's now talk about the build quality and design, and at this point we've moved back to the flat EQ settings and passive mode on the mic, but we're still going in through our Mackie VLZ3 mixer. The DynaCaster offers a fairly unique twist on the broadcast dynamic. It's all metal, really solid feeling, built like a tank you might say, but it's also really quite compact if you compare it to the SM7B. It features a built-in stand mount that was clearly designed with boom arms in mind, and you can swivel it and lock the mic with a knob at the back, and that feels really solid. You don't need to twist it very hard and the mic stays in place. It really inspires confidence in that department. The capsule itself is suspended in its own proprietary shock mount, and that appears to be fairly effective, so tapping the mic or the boom arm, if you must, doesn't really come through that much at all. Now, one of the key benefits over the SE-V7 and in particular the V7X microphones is that the DynaCaster is optimized to protect you from plosives with a 3-layer integrated pop filter. It really is one of the most effective mics I've come across that works great without a windscreen. So if I were to talk directly into the mic, Peter Piper picked a pack of pickle pineapple pizza, the pops are virtually non-existent. And if you were to talk across the mic in any way, they are more or less completely eliminated. The mic also comes with a very nice foam windscreen for double protection if you like. So if we were to put that on just now, and if I go right up on the mic and practically eat it, I can throw all sorts of Peter Piper at it and nothing gets through at all. Really quite remarkable in that respect. One of the first mics I've come across that is pretty much foolproof in terms of plosive protection. The windscreen does dull down the high end a little bit and adds a little bit of mud there, but seeing as you have the onboard EQ options there anyway, you can counteract that easily with a bit of presence boost or a low cut. So practically then, as a guest mic, I think this is pretty much ideal because it takes mic technique completely out the equation. I'm always a bit wary of giving a guest a dynamic in case they can't use it properly, but this really does inspire confidence. Now, the capsule in this mic is based around the V7 series, so there's neodymium in there to give us that smoother, extended, faster transient response, but unlike the V7 and V7X models, this is a cardioid mic as opposed to supercardioid, so I would expect the off-axis rejection to be less effective than those handheld mics. So at the moment I'm directly on the mic, this is me at 90 degrees, and when you come back to 45 degrees, you get the sense that there's only minimal fall off there. By contrast, if I were to move over to the SE-V7 now, this is how it sounds when I'm directly on the mic. This is how it sounds from 90 degrees. So I think there you can see that the fall off is much more extreme on the handheld mic. It's a subtle difference, but something to bear in mind if you want to minimize mic bleed, for example, if you have speakers either side of you. Okay, so now we're going to do some comparisons then, and I took some time to think about what would be the best way to do this, and I've decided to run the DynaCaster in active mode, fan and power engaged, and connected directly to my Antelope Audio Zen Go interface. And with the comparison mics, which are all passive dynamics, we're going to connect them to the original SC Dynamite DM1 stick, so it's a more apples to apples test. For what it's worth, I think the SC Dynamite technology, if you like, is fairly transparent and doesn't colour the sound to any noticeable degree. And I think that those that will be buying this mic will be wanting to use the active electronics, so that's the genius behind this decision. So we're going to read some spoken word with both mics at the same time and jump between them. Again, this is a new way of doing it as well, so let me know what you think about this. I just feel that the transition points, particularly mid-sentence, are often more revealing in terms of the differences or similarities than what back-to-back comparisons give us. And today we're going to read some extracts from articles by Hugh McIlvanney, who died in 2019 and is regarded as one of the greatest sports writers of any generation, I think. It really is the best journalism on football, boxing, racing that I think you'll ever read in your life. Okay, so first up we have the SE Electronics V7. The glorious improbability of what Muhammad Ali did to George Foreman in Kinshasa, Zaire, shortly before dawn on Wednesday, October 30th, 1974, is best described in the context of some briefer, more one-sided violence that occurred in Caracas, Venezuela, 7 months earlier. It was at the Poliedro Arena in the South American city that Foreman conducted his last rehearsal for the confrontation in Africa, and his swift destruction of Ken Norton was enough to make the most ardent admirers of Ali shudder with dread. And now we've moved over onto the SE Electronics V7X. Lives cannot be reduced to edited highlights, and the entirety invariably contains too much of the painful, the regrettable, and the simply banal. That truism applies especially to sports heroes, who are given a double dose of mortality, being forced to suffer an extra early experience of the dark when their talents die. In George Best's case, an addiction to alcohol, from which all his other troubles radiated chaotically, precipitated the demise of immeasurable gifts, and when it overwhelmed his body too on Friday at the age of 59, there was again a devastating sense of the premature. And now we've moved over onto the Shure SM7B. It was the grubby tumult of an unscheduled press conference in Dallas on Thursday evening that most effectively conveyed the sadness seeping through the squalor of Diego Maradona's expulsion from the World Cup. As a mass of hands holding microphones closed around him like a carnivorous plant, the drawn, slightly hunted look on his Spanish Indian face said more about the nature and origins of his predicament than the predictable words of denial and complaint that came from his mouth. And now we've moved over onto the M21TG from Beyerdynamic. Talking with Mike Tyson, listening to that light, slightly lisping voice convey a sense of confidence bordering on serenity, makes it impossible to believe that his next opponent can be anything but the merest punctuation mark in the story of the most lucrative comeback in the history of boxing. Buster Mathis Jr. is unbeaten after 22 fights, but he is a heavyweight with a silhouette disturbingly similar to that of Humpty Dumpty. Come Saturday night at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, he will have much the same prospects of avoiding a fall. And now we've moved over onto the Neumann BCM 705. The Scots in the ground could not conceal an awestruck appreciation of the glories that had been paraded before them. It is one thing to see the wonders of Puskás, Di Stefano, Gento, Vidal and the rest on a television screen. It is another to see them in the flesh, to hear their urgent shouts as they wreak precise devastation on an opposing defence. Last night they flaunted all that has made them incomparable. And now we've moved over onto the Beyerdynamic M59. Maybe the simplest tribute suits him best. He was great company. What is meant, of course, is more than that. Peter O'Sullivan swelled the pleasure of a day's racing, or a party, or one of those meals stretched to leisurely duration by good food and wine and interesting talk and much laughter. His was a nature that didn't just enhance occasions, it enriched lives. The world was lucky to have his company for so long. And finally we've moved over onto the Rode Procaster. It is always safe to assume that any benighted soul who refuses to recognise football as the most beautiful and exhilarating of team games was not in Mexico to see Brazil illuminate the World Cup finals of 1970. Everything that makes the game irresistible to an extraordinary percentage of our planet's population was concentrated into a single month of that Mexican summer. And those of us who were there will savour the privilege for the rest of our lives. Okay, so let's move on to some final thoughts then. I think there's no getting away from the fact that the DynaCaster is a fantastic sounding microphone, and given you're getting a built-in cloud lifter, EQ options and that gorgeous broadcast form factor, you're clearly getting a lot for your $300. The question then becomes, what is your use case scenario, and do you need to use all these features? Will you actually use them? Or are you better off making something like the V7 or V7X work at a third of the cost? For me, the DynaCaster in the flat voicing setting produces a sound that feels a slightly darker version of the V7X, but not quite as rolled off as the SM7B. And let's be honest, that's quite a compelling place to be here. There's a lot of warmth down below, but it's that top end extension is really noticeable in some of the comparisons there, and it really gives the mic a lovely sheen and sparkle without sounding overly bright. And for me, I'd probably just be the boring one and keep it in flat mode all the time. And that's a critical thing to bear in mind here. If you're just buying for yourself, you're only going to need the one voicing setting and then just leave it. And in that sense, it might be more cost effective to find a mic that provides that sound out the box. And if you have decent preamps in your studio, there's no reason to run this in active mode. So again, that's another feature I probably won't be using, certainly here at home. But where this comes into its own is if you're using this on multiple voices or instruments, you have that flexibility to optimize the sound at the point of capture. You can feel confident that it will sound good on lesser quality equipment if you're traveling, for example, to another studio or even just to a friend's house. Having that 30 dB of clean gain at the flick of a switch is really very useful. That flexibility can save you having to buy 3 or 4 different mics. So I think you need to think about your use case scenario and the equipment you're going to be using it with. Being really good at plosive rejection is another tick in the box for using it as a guest mic. It's pretty much foolproof. You can stick anyone in front of it and it's going to sound good. But again, if you have good mic technique and you know what you're doing, there's no reason why you can't make the V7X work with a cheap pop filter. But knowing what you're doing takes different interpretations. A lot of people will be buying this mic because of how it looks. That's what made the pod mic one of the most best-selling broadcast dynamics in the world, and that's not really anything to do with how it sounds. Let's be honest about the market here. How it looks is everything, regardless of how annoying I personally find that. I still believe the budget handheld dynamic market, your V7s, ProDype TT1, secondhand Beyerdynamics, offers the best sound to value over broadcast dynamics. More money goes into the capsules and less on the bodies and what they look like. But what tends to happen is people buy cheap, and after a short while they discover their preamps, interfaces or other parts of their signal chain are not really up to it, and end up buying cloud lifters, pop filters, even EQ plugins to improve their audio. It's a rabbit hole, I know because I've done it. The DynaCaster solves all that, providing that high-end sound, the 30 dB boost, the EQ options, the ease of use, and the looks at pretty much the cost of buying all those elements separately, even cheaper. It's a buy once, buy right product. But the question will be whether the consumer sees it that way, and in that sense, at this price point, I'm not as confident for it. The mic has absolutely moved dynamics on in terms of flexibility, and if those combination of features are everything you're looking for, then this is pretty much the only game in town. But if you don't need all those options, there are less expensive ways to get this kind of sound. Okay, so that about wraps it up for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've certainly enjoyed making this one and getting this one out fairly early. There aren't many recordings of the DynaCaster out there at the moment. So I hope you all have a really good Christmas and New Year, and we'll see you again then. Until then, take care and stay safe.